Now up to this point, I always just worked with my main view app here. Typically, of course, you have multiple components. Let's say we have a separate component for the user data here. So we could create a components folder and in there have a userdata.view file. And here in the template, I want to have my h2 tag with the username. And I want to have my h3 tag with my age. Now we can add a script here and we can expect some props here because that data should come from outside, username and age. So we could add a username and age prop here and now simply go back to app.view and import this user data component from /components userdata.view and register it with the components option. And as I mentioned before, you still have this option. This does not go into the setup method. You keep your option here. So we register user data here, this new component, and we can then use it here. User data, opening and closing, and bind those props. User name and age. And I'll bind username to my username computed ref, which is exposed here in the returned object to the template, and bind age to this age ref, which we're also exposing. And that, therefore, all just works, as you can tell. However, maybe we want to do more in this component. Maybe here we want to use the setup method as well, because maybe we don't get the username like this, but instead we get the first name and last name separated. And we want to compute it here in the setup method. Well, first of all, let's maybe not use the setup method, but a good old computed option. So let's use the options API here. Then we could have a username computed property, since that's what I'm using here in the template, and simply return this dot first name plus blank plus this dot last name. Right? This is how we could do this in a regular component using the options API if we get two props and we want to merge it into one computed prop. Now we just need to bind first and last name. So in app view, I now bind first name and last name. And the values here should be my first name ref and my last name ref. And we now need to ensure that both are exposed to the template. The first name ref already is, but the last name ref is not anymore. So let's re-add last name to the object which we are returning in setup, so that this is available in the template. And now first name and last name are forwarded to user data. And if I save that, this just works. And this might or might not be a surprise, but there's a very important message here. You can absolutely mix the options and the composition API. App view uses the composition API, user data view uses the options API. And there's nothing wrong with it, absolutely nothing. Just because you use the composition API in one component does not mean you have to use it in all components. It's optional. You can use it wherever it makes sense to you. So it is absolutely fine to use the options API and therefore the computed option here in user data. And you see that those ref values are extracted correctly by view and forwarded as values for first and last name props. Nonetheless, even though we don't have to, let's say we want to migrate to the composition API inside of user data as well. So instead of using computed here, we import computed from the view framework like this, and we then add our setup method. Here we got our uname, let's say. Of course, this name is up to you. And we derive it by calling computed and passing a function to computed, where we now return, well, return what? We want to get access to our props here, first name and last name. In the computed option, we did it with the this keyword, but I can tell you, and I told you before, that this will not work like that. So if we try to use the this keyword and get access to our props here, this won't work. We can still give it a try. Let's return username here as an object and point at the computed uname property so that in the template username is available. And let's save this. And you'll notice that I can reload and get an error. Cannot read property first name of undefined. So trying to access first name on this fails because this is undefined at this point. Because setup basically gets called too early by Vue. At this point of time, the Vue instance object doesn't exist yet. So we don't have access to props like that. Still, of course, we do get access to props, because setup actually is a method that accepts two arguments. The first parameter we get here is the props parameter. It's an object full of the props you're getting in this component. And therefore you can simply access props.firstName and props.lastName like this. Now you can name this argument however you want, by the way. It's your method, so any name of your choice is fine, but I'll go with props and I'll stick to props throughout this course here. And with that, if we save this and reload, now it's working again, as you can tell. So the setup method receives this props argument automatically passed in by Vue. If your component gets no props, it's simply an empty object. You always get this props thing, but it can be empty if you don't have any props. Here we do have free props, and therefore they're all part of this props object. And whenever props should change from outside, this change is also propagated here to the setup method, and computed, for example, will pick up that props changed and will recalculate it uname. As you can tell, if I type here, it updates up here, which is in that different component. So props by default are reactive, not the individual values in there, but the props object as a whole. So whenever the props object as a whole changes, which will happen whenever one of the prop changes, Vue will notice this and will rerun any code that depends on props.